In the quiet shadows of history, there exists a city that history almost forgot. Yet, from its cobblestone streets emerged a mind that would reshape how humanity understands itself. Königsberg, perched on the cold Baltic coast of Prussia, was neither Rome nor Paris, neither the heart of empire nor the center of culture. It was a merchant city, a trading post where East met West, where German burghers counted their coins while Russian traders haggled over amber and grain. The year was 1724, and Europe was stirring from old dreams into something new, something that would come to be called Enlightenment. On the 22nd of April, in a modest house in the Vorstadt district, a child entered this world. His parents, Johann Georg Kant and Anna Regina, named him Immanuel, though he would later prefer the Hebrew spelling Immanuel, meaning God is with us. It was a name heavy with expectation, though nothing in that moment suggested the weight this child would one day carry. Johann Georg was a saddle maker, a craftsman whose hands knew leather and awl, whose world was measured in practical things, tangible things, things you could touch and shape and sell. There was no money for luxuries in this household, no grand library, no tutors from Vienna or Leipzig. What they had was faith, the austere, demanding faith of pietism, and a belief that even the poorest child might rise if God willed it, and the child worked hard enough. The Kant family was neither destitute nor comfortable. They occupied that precarious middle ground where respectability required constant vigilance, where one bad season or one illness could send everything tumbling into poverty. Immanuel was the fourth of 9 children, though death would visit often, as it did in those times when childhood was no guarantee of reaching adulthood. In the Kant household, every mouth to feed mattered. Every expense was weighed, every opportunity carefully considered. But Königsberg itself offered something that poverty could not entirely take away. It offered ideas. The city had a university founded nearly a century before, and though it was not among the great institutions of Europe, it was a place where learning happened, where books arrived from distant places, where professors debated the new philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff, where the discoveries of Newton were whispered about in lecture halls. The city was a crossroads, and crossroads are where things meet and mix and become something new. Young Immanuel would grow up in this place of contradictions, this city that was both provincial and cosmopolitan, both pious and worldly, both isolated and connected to the great currents of European thought. He would spend his entire life here, never venturing more than 60 miles from the city walls, yet somehow his mind would travel further than any explorer's ship. But that story was still decades away. For now there was only an infant in a craftsman's home, crying his first cries, breathing his first breaths, beginning a journey that would never take him anywhere, and yet would take him everywhere. The child grew as children do, though perhaps more quietly than most. Those who knew the young Immanuel in those early years would remember him as slight of build, narrow-chested, almost frail, the sort of boy who seemed more suited to books than to the rough games of street children. His father worked long hours in the workshop, the smell of leather and saddle soap permeating their home, the rhythmic sound of hammer and awl marking the passage of days. Johann Georg was a man of few words but firm convictions, a man who believed in honest labor and honest faith. He had come to Königsberg from Memel, carrying with him the work ethic of generations of craftsmen, and he expected nothing less from his children. But it was Anna Regina, Immanuel's mother, who would leave the deeper mark on the boy's developing soul. She was a woman of genuine piety, not the showy kind that seeks recognition, but the quiet, steady kind that shapes a life from the inside. In an age when mothers taught their children prayers by rote and expected obedience without understanding, Anna Regina was different. She talked to her children about conscience, about duty, about the voice inside, that tells you right from wrong even when no one is watching. She would take young Immanuel on walks outside the city, showing him the stars, speaking of the wonder and order of God's creation. Years later, when Kant had become famous, he would write that he learned two things that filled him with awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Both lessons began with his mother. The Kant household was shaped by Pietism, that Protestant movement that emphasized personal faith and moral living over ritual and dogma. It was a demanding faith, one that asked believers to examine themselves constantly, to root out sin, to live lives of rigorous self-discipline. For young Immanuel, this meant prayers before dawn, Bible study, constant self-examination. It could be suffocating, this atmosphere of perpetual moral scrutiny, and later in life, Kant would speak carefully about his religious upbringing, grateful for the ethical training but wary of the emotional excess that sometimes accompanied Pietist practice. Then came the blow that would change everything. In 1737, when Immanuel was just 13 years old, Anna Regina died. She had been ill for some time, her strength gradually fading, and her death, while not unexpected, left a void in the household that nothing could fill. For the sensitive, thoughtful boy who had found in his mother not just affection, but intellectual companionship, the loss was profound. He would never speak much about it in later years, but those who knew him well saw how carefully he guarded his emotions, how he built walls of routine and reason around himself, perhaps protecting against the pain of another such loss. The family's circumstances grew harder after Anna Regina's death. Johann Georg struggled to manage both his business and his children. Money, always tight, became tighter. Yet Immanuel's education could not stop. His mother had seen something in him, some spark of unusual intelligence, and before her death, she had secured his admission to the Collegium Fridericianum, a prestigious school that normally served the children of merchants and minor nobility. It was a scholarship place, a charity case, and Immanuel knew it. He would arrive in his shabby clothes, conscious of the difference between himself and the well-dressed sons of comfortable families. But he had his mother's legacy, her belief that he was meant for something more than saddles and leather. And so the poor boy walked through the doors of the Collegium, carrying with him the weight of a dead mother's dreams and a living father's sacrifices, ready to begin the education that would, in time, change the world. The Collegium Fridericianum was no gentle place of learning. Founded by Pietist reformers who believed that education should shape not just the mind but the soul, it operated more like a monastery than a school. Students rose before dawn for prayers, endured long hours of Latin grammar and biblical exegesis, ate plain food, and lived under constant surveillance by masters who watched for any sign of moral laxity. It was designed to break the will to humble pride, to create obedient servants of God and the Prussian state. For 8 years, from age 8 to 16, Immanuel Kant would endure this rigorous, often joyless routine. And yet, within this austere environment, something remarkable happened. The boy discovered the life of the mind. Latin, that ancient language of empire and church, became for him not a dead tongue to be memorized, but a key that unlocked centuries of thought. Through Latin, he read Virgil and Cicero, and though his schoolmasters intended these texts to provide moral lessons, young Kant found in them something more. He found the power of reason, the beauty of argument carefully constructed, the satisfaction of following an idea to its logical conclusion. The Pietists wanted to train his soul, but they were also, inadvertently, training his mind to think with precision and rigor. The curriculum at the Collegium was traditional, focused heavily on theology and classical languages, but it also included mathematics and natural philosophy, what we would today call science. Here Immanuel discovered Newton, or rather, discovered the Newtonian revolution as it had been explained and systematized by German philosophers like Christian Wolff. the idea that the universe operated according to mathematical laws, that the motions of planets and the fall of an apple were governed by the same principles. That human reason could uncover these laws and understand God's design. This was intoxicating to a young mind hungry for certainty and order. But the Collegium was also a place of suffering. The discipline was harsh, sometimes brutal. Students who showed independent thinking were corrected, sometimes physically. The emphasis on constant self-examination and confession of sins created an atmosphere of anxiety and fear. In later life, Kant would recall these years with little fondness. He respected what the education had given him, the intellectual tools, the habits of discipline and hard work. But he never romanticized it. He knew what it cost, the emotional price of such relentless moral pressure. As the years passed, Immanuel distinguished himself as a student. He excelled particularly in Latin and theology, showing a gift for argument and analysis that his teachers had noted with approval. They imagined he might become a minister, perhaps a professor of theology. They saw a brilliant student, obedient and hardworking. What they did not see, what perhaps no one saw, was the question forming in his mind, the question that would drive all his later work. How do we know what we know? How can reason be certain? What are the limits and possibilities of human understanding? In 1740, at age 16, Immanuel Kant completed his studies at the Collegium Fridericianum. He left that austere building behind, but he carried with him its gifts and its wounds, a trained mind, a strong will, a deep moral sense, and perhaps a certain coldness, a need for control and routine that would mark him all his life. The poor saddle-maker's son was ready for university, ready for the next step in a journey that would lead him, paradoxically, nowhere and everywhere at once. The University of Königsberg awaited just a few streets away, and with it, the true beginning of a philosophical revolution. In the autumn of 1740, a slender young man of 16 walked through the gates of the Albertina, the University of Königsberg, carrying little more than his intelligence and his poverty. Immanuel Kant had escaped the suffocating atmosphere of the Collegium Fridericianum, but he had not escaped Königsberg itself, nor would he ever. The university was only a short walk from his childhood home, yet in intellectual terms it might as well have been another world. Here, professors debated the latest ideas from Paris and London. Here, books arrived from Leipzig and Amsterdam. Here, the frontiers of human knowledge were being pushed forward. Inch by careful inch, Kant enrolled officially as a theology student, which made sense given his background and the expectations of his sponsors. But from the beginning, his interests wandered far beyond the narrow confines of religious doctrine. He attended lectures on mathematics, physics, philosophy, and natural science. He was particularly drawn to the work of Martin Knutzen, a young professor who taught both mathematics and philosophy and who introduced his students to the Newtonian worldview. Through Knutzen, Kant encountered the intoxicating idea that the universe was not a mystery to be accepted on faith, but a puzzle to be solved through reason and observation. The young student devoured texts with the hunger of someone who had been intellectually starved. He read Leibniz and Wolff, the great systematizers of German rationalism, who believed that all truth could be derived through pure reason. He read the British empiricists, Locke and later Hume, who argued that all knowledge comes from experience. He read Newton's Principia, that monument of mathematical physics that had revealed the laws governing celestial motion. These were not idle studies for Kant. Each book, each lecture, each idea was a piece in a larger puzzle he was trying to solve. How does the human mind work? What can we truly know? Where do the limits of reason lie? But while Kant's mind soared through these abstract questions, his circumstances remained stubbornly earthbound. He was poor, desperately poor. His father, struggling in his saddle-making business, could offer little financial support. Kant survived on small scholarships and by tutoring other students, eating poorly, dressing shabbily, always conscious of the gap between himself and the sons of wealthy families who studied alongside him. There is something poignant about this image, a mind capable of revolutionizing philosophy, trapped in a body that often went hungry, wearing coats with patches, counting every coin. Then, in 1746, when Kant was 22 and still working toward his degree, his father died. Johann Georg Kant passed away, having seen his son enter university, but not knowing whether that investment would ever bear fruit. The financial situation became even more precarious. Kant had siblings who needed support, debts that needed paying. He could no longer afford to be merely a student. He would need to find work, and quickly. In 1749, at age 25, Kant finally completed his studies and received his degree. His thesis, titled Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces, was an ambitious attempt to resolve a debate in physics about the nature of force and motion. It showed flashes of brilliance, but also revealed a young thinker still finding his way, still struggling to develop his own voice amid the competing philosophical systems of his time. The university was not yet ready to offer him a position. There was no professorship waiting, no easy path forward. And so, with a degree but no prospects, Immanuel Kant left Königsberg for the first time in his life, not to see the world, but simply to survive. He would become what countless educated but penniless young men had become before him: a private tutor in a wealthy household, his brilliant mind temporarily in service to the ordinary education of children who would never appreciate what they had. For 9 years, Immanuel Kant disappeared from the intellectual life of Königsberg. Not physically, for he remained in the region, never venturing far from his home city, but intellectually he vanished into the private world of wealthy families who needed someone educated to teach their children French, mathematics, geography, and the social graces. It was respectable work, but it was not what Kant had studied for, not what his mother had dreamed of, not what his own ambitions whispered to him in quiet moments. These were the wilderness years, when the future seemed uncertain and the great work that lay ahead remained hidden, even from himself. His first position was with the family of a reformed minister named Anders in the village of Jutschen, about 20 miles from Königsberg. Here, Kant taught the children their lessons and in his spare moments continued his own studies. The work was not demanding intellectually, which meant he had time to read, to think, to write. In the household of Pastor Anders, he was neither servant nor family member, but something in between, that peculiar position of the educated poor in aristocratic households. He dined with the family but knew his place. He had authority over the children but none over his own destiny. Later he moved to the household of Major von Hülsen and then to the estate of Count Kaiserling near the town of Rautenburg. The von Hülsen and Kaiserling families were among the Prussian nobility, and in their homes Kant encountered a world very different from the austere pietism of his youth. Here was refined conversation, music, social gatherings, a certain lightness of spirit that the grim moralists of the Collegium Fridericianum would have condemned. Kant observed this world with the eye of an outsider, never quite belonging but learning from it nonetheless. In later years he would be known for his skill in conversation, his ability to discuss any topic with grace and wit, his enjoyment of social dinners. These were skills learned, at least in part, during his years as a tutor among the nobility. But more importantly, these years gave him something precious: time to develop his own thoughts without the pressure of academic politics or the need to conform to any particular school of philosophy. He continued to write, producing papers on earthquakes, on the theory of winds, on whether the earth was aging, on the rotation of the earth. These were works of natural philosophy, showing Kant's engagement with the physical sciences, his attempt to understand the mechanisms of the natural world. In 1755, he published his most ambitious early work, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, in which he proposed a theory for the formation of the solar system from a rotating cloud of gas and dust. It was a remarkably prescient idea, one that would later be developed independently by Pierre-Simon Laplace and become known as the Kant-Laplace hypothesis. Yet for all these intellectual achievements, Kant was not building a career or a reputation. His publications went largely unnoticed. He was a private tutor in the provinces, not a professor at a university. He was approaching 30, then passing 30, and the years were slipping by. His siblings had their own lives now. His childhood friends had established themselves in professions, and Kant was still teaching children their multiplication tables and correcting their French pronunciation. Brilliant and unrecognized, his mind working on problems that almost no one cared about, in a position that offered neither prestige nor future. There is something both frustrating and necessary about these wilderness years. Frustrating because we see the waste of a great mind, the delay of important work, but necessary because perhaps Kant needed this time, needed to think deeply without the constraints of academic orthodoxy, needed to develop his ideas slowly and carefully, needed to mature, not just intellectually but emotionally and socially. The man who would eventually return to Königsberg and revolutionize philosophy was being formed in these quiet years of tutoring and writing and waiting. Sometimes the path to greatness winds through obscurity, and those who walk it must trust that the journey means something even when no one is watching. In 1755, at age 31, Immanuel Kant made his move. He returned to Königsberg, not as a tutor, but as an aspiring academic, determined to establish himself at the university where he had studied 15 years before. He completed the requirements for his habilitation, the qualification that would allow him to lecture, submitting not one, but 2 dissertations to demonstrate his range and ability. The topics were characteristic of his broad interests, one on fire, examining the physical principles of combustion, and another on the first principles of metaphysical knowledge. The university accepted his work, and suddenly, after 9 years in the wilderness, Kant was back where he belonged, in the world of ideas and debate and intellectual community. But being qualified to teach and actually making a living from teaching were 2 different things. Kant's position was that of private docent, a private lecturer who received no salary from the university. Instead, he would be paid directly by students who chose to attend his lectures, a few coins per student per course. It was a precarious existence, entirely dependent on popularity and reputation. If students didn't come, the lecturer didn't eat. It was a system that favored showmanship over depth, entertainment over rigor. And yet somehow Kant thrived. He taught everything. Logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, natural theology, yes, but also physical geography, anthropology, mathematics, mineralogy, even fortification engineering. He would teach up to 20 hours per week, sometimes more, covering topics he had to learn himself just days before presenting them to students. It was exhausting work, intellectually demanding, physically draining. But Kant discovered that he loved teaching, loved the interaction with young minds, loved the challenge of making difficult ideas clear and engaging. His lectures became popular, known for their wit, their practical examples, their refusal to traffic in abstract jargon. Students came not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because Kant made philosophy come alive. The years passed, and Kant remained a private docent. He applied for professorships when they became available, but again and again he was passed over. The university preferred candidates with more conventional views, with better political connections, with more impressive publications. Kant published steadily during this period works on optimism, on physical monadology, on negative magnitudes, but none of them caused the sensation that might have secured him a position. He was respected, certainly, regarded as intelligent and learned, but he was not yet seen as exceptional, not yet recognized as the revolutionary thinker he would become. Meanwhile, life in Königsberg settled into patterns that would define the rest of Kant's existence. He rented rooms in the city, living simply, spending his limited income carefully. He developed a circle of friends, merchants and minor officials mostly, with whom he would dine and play cards and discuss the news of the day. He established a daily routine of almost mechanical precision, waking at the same time, working at the same hours, walking at the same time each afternoon. The citizens of Königsberg would joke that you could set your clock by Kant's daily walk. This rigid routine was not mere eccentricity. For Kant, it was necessary discipline, a way of controlling his environment so that his mind could be free to explore the most abstract questions. In 1770, at age 46, after 15 years as a private dozent, Kant finally received his appointment as professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. It had taken decades, but he had arrived. He had security now, a salary, a position of respect. But what no one knew, what Kant himself perhaps only dimly sensed, was that his greatest work still lay ahead. The long preparation, the years of teaching and thinking and reading and questioning had been necessary. Now, finally, with his position secure and his routine established, with no more need to chase after temporary positions or worry about where the next meal would come from, Kant could focus on the question that had haunted him since his university days: how is knowledge possible? The answer would take another decade of silent struggle, but when it came, it would change philosophy forever. There are moments in intellectual history when a great mind circles around a problem, approaching it from different angles, testing different solutions, building the tools that will eventually allow for breakthrough. The years between Kant's return to Königsberg and his appointment as professor were precisely such a period. He published steadily, works on topics ranging from the physical to the metaphysical, each one a kind of reconnaissance mission into territory he did not yet know how to conquer. Later scholars would call this his pre-critical period, the years before the great critical philosophy that would define his legacy. But Kant himself did not know he was building toward anything. He was simply thinking, writing, struggling with questions that refused to yield easy answers. During these years, Kant engaged deeply with the competing philosophical traditions of his time. On one side stood the rationalists, followers of Leibniz and Wolff, who believed that true knowledge came from reason alone, that the mind could deduce the nature of reality through pure thought, that mathematics offered a model for all genuine knowledge. On the other side stood the empiricists, the British philosophers like Locke and Berkeley, who argued that all knowledge must come from experience, from the evidence of the senses, that reason alone could tell us nothing about the actual world. Each side had powerful arguments. Each side seemed to capture something true about how we know things. And yet, each side also seemed to miss something essential. Kant found himself caught between these two worlds, unable to fully embrace either position. The rationalists were right that some knowledge seems necessary and universal, true in all possible worlds. Mathematical truths, for instance, or the basic laws of logic. These cannot be derived from experience, because experience is always particular and contingent. Yet the empiricists were also right that we cannot know anything about the actual world without experience. Pure reason, spinning in its own abstractions, tells us nothing about whether tables exist or what color the sky is. How could both be true? How could knowledge be both dependent on experience and yet contain elements that transcend any particular experience? Then came the earthquake, intellectual rather than geological, though Kant had written about those as well. In the 1760s, Kant encountered the work of David Hume, the Scottish skeptic, whose arguments cut like a knife through the comfortable certainties of traditional philosophy. Hume argued that we have no rational basis for believing in cause and effect, that our confidence that the sun will rise tomorrow or that fire will burn is merely habit. Custom, the psychological residue of repeated experience, We have never observed causation itself, only the constant conjunction of events. And from constant conjunction, no logical inference to necessary connection is possible. If Hume was right, then science itself, which depends entirely on causal reasoning, had no rational foundation. It was merely a useful fiction, a pattern we impose on experience rather than something we discover in it. Years later, Kant would write that Hume's arguments interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction. It was not that Kant immediately accepted Hume's skepticism. Indeed, he found it both brilliant and deeply disturbing. If philosophy could not answer Hume's challenge, if it could not provide a rational foundation for the knowledge we use every day, then what was philosophy good for? But if Hume was wrong, where exactly was the mistake? How could one prove that causation was more than mere habit, that knowledge was more than probable opinion? The problem gnawed at Kant through the 1760s and into the 1770s. He published works on various topics, some quite brilliant, earning him growing respect among German intellectuals. But he knew these were preliminary efforts, that the real question, the fundamental question about the possibility and limits of human knowledge, remained unanswered. He was appointed professor in 1770, giving him finally the security and time he needed. And then, strangely, the publications stopped. For nearly a decade, one of the most prolific writers in German philosophy would publish almost nothing. His friends worried. Had he run out of ideas? Had the years of struggle exhausted his creativity? They could not know that Kant had withdrawn from the public sphere precisely because he was attempting something unprecedented, something that required complete focus and years of patient labor. He was trying to answer once and for all the question of how knowledge is possible. The year 1770 marked a turning point, not just in Kant's professional circumstances, but in his entire way of life. At 46 years old, after decades of financial insecurity and academic uncertainty, he finally received what he had worked toward for so long: appointment as professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. It was not a position at Berlin or Göttingen, not a chair at one of the great universities of Europe. But it was his, permanent and salaried, and it was in Königsberg, the city he had never really left and now never would. With this appointment came a transformation in Kant's daily existence. For the first time in his adult life, he had enough money to live comfortably, if not luxuriously. He could afford better lodgings, better food, even a servant to manage his household. More importantly, he had time. No longer did he need to hustle for students, teaching 20 or more hours per week on every conceivable topic just to make ends meet. He could be selective about his courses, could focus on the subjects that truly mattered to him. He could think without the constant anxiety about money that had shadowed his life since childhood. Kant used this newfound security to establish a life of remarkable, almost obsessive regularity. He would rise each morning at 5 o'clock, winter and summer, regardless of how he felt. His servant, a retired soldier named Lampe, had strict instructions to wake him no matter what protests the half-asleep philosopher might offer. After rising, Kant would drink his tea, smoke his pipe, and prepare his lectures for the day. He taught in the morning hours, holding forth on logic, metaphysics, ethics, his classroom packed with students who came not just from Königsberg, but from across Prussia and beyond to hear the increasingly famous professor. After his lectures, Kant would work in his study, reading, writing, thinking. Then, at precisely 1 o'clock, came the highlight of his day, dinner. Kant never dined alone if he could help it. He would invite 3 or 4 friends or colleagues, and for 2 or 3 hours they would eat and talk and laugh. Kant was a brilliant conversationalist, witty and well-informed, able to discuss anything from politics to science to gossip about the latest scandal in Paris. He insisted on one rule: no shop talk, no pedantic philosophy. Dinner was for pleasure, for the social enjoyment of ideas lightly worn, for the human connection that makes life bearable. After dinner came the famous walk. Every afternoon at 3:30, Kant would emerge from his house and walk the same route through Königsberg, dressed in his grey coat, carrying his cane, moving at the same measured pace. The citizens of the city would set their clocks by his passage. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, that Kant only deviated from his walk twice. Once, when he received Rousseau's Emile and became so absorbed that he forgot the time, and again when news arrived of the French Revolution. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential about Kant. His life was regulated, mechanical almost, not because he loved routine for its own sake, but because routine freed his mind for the work that truly mattered. Evenings were for more reading and light work, and then bed at precisely 10 o'clock. Day after day, year after year, the same pattern, varied only by the seasons and the occasional illness. To outsiders, it might have seemed a small life, bounded by a small city, confined to predictable rhythms. No grand adventures, no romantic escapades, no dramatic reversals of fortune. Just a professor teaching his classes, taking his walks, dining with his friends, working in his study. But within that ordered exterior, something extraordinary was happening. Kant's mind was ranging across the entire domain of human knowledge, questioning everything, rebuilding from the foundations up. The routine was not a prison, but a fortress, protecting the most important work of his life from the distractions and demands that scatter attention and dilute focus. And then silence. After 1770, the steady stream of publications that had marked Kant's earlier career slowed to a trickle and then stopped almost entirely. For nearly a decade, one of the most productive philosophical writers in Germany published virtually nothing of substance. His friends noticed. Colleagues wondered. Had Kant said all he had to say? Had the creative fire burned out, leaving only the competent teacher, the pleasant dinner companion, the clockwork walker? Letters arrived asking about new work, invitations to contribute to journals and collections. Kant politely declined or simply did not respond. He continued teaching, continued his daily routine, but the work that had previously flowed so readily seemed to have dried up completely. What no one outside Kant's inner circle understood was that this silence was not absence, but intense presence. Not emptiness, but overwhelming fullness. Kant was working on something unprecedented, something so ambitious that he barely knew himself how to accomplish it. He was attempting to answer Hume's skeptical challenge, to provide a foundation for all human knowledge, to determine once and for all what reason can and cannot know, to chart the boundaries between legitimate inquiry and empty speculation. It was a project that required him to question everything he had previously believed, to examine the most basic operations of the mind, to create an entirely new philosophical vocabulary because the old one proved inadequate to what he was trying to say. The work was agonizing. Kant would later describe these years as a struggle, a constant wrestling with problems that refused to yield to his analysis. How do we form concepts? How does the mind organize the chaos of sensory experience into coherent knowledge? What makes mathematics possible? What allows us to make universal claims based on particular observations? These questions had been asked before, but Kant was pursuing them with a rigor and depth that no previous philosopher had attempted. He was not content with plausible answers or eloquent hand-waving. He wanted certainty, wanted to prove his claims with the kind of necessity that mathematicians prove theorems. During these silent years, Kant filled pages and pages with notes, arguments, attempted solutions, false starts. He would develop a line of reasoning for weeks or months, only to discover a flaw that forced him to begin again. His correspondence became sparse. When he did write to friends, he would mention being close to completion, that the work would be published soon. but soon became next year, then the year after, then the year after that. His study filled with papers, drafts, revisions. The daily walks continued, but now they served a different purpose. Kant would walk not for pleasure, but to think, working through arguments in his mind, testing them against objections, refining and reformulating. His friends and colleagues grew increasingly concerned. Some thought he had become obsessed, lost in abstractions that no one else would care about. Others worried about his health, physical and mental. The isolation was nearly complete. Not social isolation, for Kant still entertained at dinner and attended gatherings, but intellectual isolation. He could not explain what he was working on because he did not yet fully understand it himself. The ideas were too complex, too radical, too different from anything in the existing philosophical literature. He was creating a new way of thinking about thinking itself, and such work cannot be done quickly or in collaboration. It must be done alone in silence through years of patient struggle. There is something both admirable and slightly mad about this decade of Kant's life. The sheer determination, the willingness to spend years on a single project with no guarantee of success, the faith that the questions he was pursuing mattered enough to justify such sacrifice. Many would have given up, published something partial and moved on. But Kant persisted, driven by a conviction that philosophy must be able to answer Hume's skepticism, that human knowledge must have a firmer foundation than mere custom and habit. And slowly, painfully, through countless revisions and reconceptualizations, the work took shape. By the late 1770s, Kant finally saw the path forward. The breakthrough had come. Now it was merely a matter of writing it all down, of translating the ideas in his head into words on paper, of producing the book that would, though he could not know it, change philosophy forever. The silence was almost over. The revolution was about to begin. In 1781, a thick, dense, impossibly difficult book appeared in German bookshops. Its title was forbidding, Critique of Pure Reason. Its author was a 57-year-old professor from Königsberg, whom few outside academic circles had heard of. The prose was technical, the arguments labyrinthine, the vocabulary unlike anything in previous philosophy. The first edition sold slowly. Reviewers who attempted to understand it admitted bafflement. One critic wrote that the book would drive readers to madness. Another suggested it was simply incomprehensible. Even sympathetic readers struggled to grasp what Kant was trying to say. The book seemed destined for obscurity, just another forgotten treatise in the endless production of academic philosophy. Yet within that difficult prose lay an earthquake. Kant had done what he promised himself during those silent years. He had answered Hume's skepticism, provided a foundation for human knowledge, and in the process revolutionized how we understand the relationship between mind and world. His central insight was radical, audacious, and once you grasp it, impossible to forget. Previous philosophers had assumed that the mind must conform to objects, that knowledge meant the mind passively receiving impressions from a world already fully formed and independent. Kant reversed this assumption. What if, he asked, objects must conform to our minds? What if the mind does not merely receive experience but actively structures it, imposing order and form on the raw chaos of sensation? This was Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had challenged the assumption that the sun revolves around the earth, showing instead that the earth revolves around the sun, so Kant challenged the assumption that the mind revolves around objects, showing instead that objects, as we experience them, conform to the structure of our minds. Space and time are not features of things in themselves, but forms of human intuition, the framework our minds impose on experience. Causation is not something we discover in nature, but a category our minds use to organize experience. We never experience things as they are in themselves, only as they appear to us, filtered through the necessary structures of human cognition. This solved Hume's problem. Hume was right that we never perceive causation directly, never see necessity in the connections between events. But he was wrong to conclude that causation is merely habit. Causation is a necessary feature of experience because it is a necessary structure of the human mind. We cannot experience anything without experiencing it as standing in causal relations, just as we cannot experience anything without experiencing it in space and time. These are the preconditions of any possible experience. Science is possible, mathematics is possible, because they describe not things in themselves, but the necessary structure of human experience. But Kant's revolution came with a price he accepted but which troubled many of his readers. If we only know things as they appear to us, never as they are in themselves, then vast domains of traditional philosophy become impossible. We cannot prove God's existence through pure reason, cannot demonstrate the immortality of the soul, cannot know whether we have free will, cannot answer metaphysical questions about the ultimate nature of reality. These questions, Kant argued, lie beyond the boundaries of possible experience and therefore beyond the reach of human knowledge. Reason, when it ventures beyond experience, falls into contradictions and illusions. Metaphysics, as traditionally practiced, is impossible. The implications were staggering. Kant had both saved and destroyed philosophy as it had been practiced for centuries. He saved it by showing that knowledge is possible, that Hume's skepticism can be answered. But he destroyed it by showing that vast swaths of traditional philosophical inquiry are based on fundamental confusion about what reason can accomplish. The book was not immediately recognized as revolutionary. It was too difficult, too strange, too unlike anything that had come before. But gradually, as younger philosophers began to study it seriously, to work through its arguments, to grasp its implications, the revolution spread. Nothing in philosophy would ever be quite the same. An obscure professor in a provincial city had redrawn the map of human thought. Knowledge was only half of Kant's project. He had shown the possibility and limits of theoretical reason of what we can know about the world of experience. But what about practical reason, the reason that governs action, that tells us what we ought to do rather than what is the case? If metaphysics was impossible as theoretical knowledge, what happened to morality? Could ethics survive the critical philosophy, or had Kant's revolution destroyed the foundations of moral life as thoroughly as it had destroyed traditional metaphysics? In 1788, 7 years after the first critique, Kant published his answer, The Critique of Practical Reason. Here he argued that while theoretical reason cannot prove God, freedom or immortality, practical reason requires us to presuppose them. We cannot know that we are free in the theoretical sense, cannot demonstrate it scientifically or metaphysically. But we must act as if we are free because moral obligation makes no sense without freedom. The command "you ought" implies you can. An ethics based on duty presupposes that we are free to choose, that we are not merely biological machines determined by physical laws. At the heart of Kant's moral philosophy lay one of the most famous and influential ideas in ethics, the categorical imperative. Kant distinguished between hypothetical imperatives, which command conditionally, and categorical imperatives, which command unconditionally. If you want to be healthy, exercise is hypothetical. It only applies if you have that goal. But do not lie is categorical. It applies regardless of your goals, regardless of consequences, simply because it is right. The moral law, Kant argued, must be categorical. It must hold universally for all rational beings in all circumstances. But what is this moral law? How do we determine what we ought to do? Kant's answer was the categorical imperative, which he formulated in several ways, each illuminating a different aspect of moral duty. The most famous formulation was, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Before acting, ask yourself, could everyone act this way? Could my maxim be universalized without contradiction? If you are considering lying to get what you want, Ask whether a world where everyone lied whenever convenient could function. It could not, because lying depends on a general presumption of truth-telling. If everyone lied, lying itself would become impossible. The maxim contradicts itself when universalized, and therefore it is immoral. Another formulation, perhaps even more powerful, commanded, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. People are not tools to be used for your purposes, not objects to be manipulated. They are rational beings with their own dignity, their own worth, their own capacity for moral choice. To treat someone merely as a means is to deny their humanity, to violate the respect that all persons are owed simply by virtue of being rational agents. This was an ethics radically different from anything that had come before. Previous moral theories had grounded ethics in happiness, in virtue, in divine command, in natural law, in sentiment. Kant grounded it in reason alone. You do not need religion to be moral, do not need to calculate consequences, do not need to cultivate virtues over years of practice. You need only to be rational, to think clearly about what could be universalized, to respect the rational nature in yourself and others. Morality is not about being happy or successful or admired. It is about duty, about doing what is right because it is right, regardless of cost or benefit. Critics immediately objected. Kant's ethics seemed cold, rigid, inhuman. What about love, compassion, mercy? What about the complexity of real moral situations where duties conflict and consequences matter? Kant acknowledged the force of these questions, but insisted that morality must have a foundation in reason, not in feeling, because feelings change and differ between people. Only reason provides the universal, necessary ground that morality requires. You might act from love or compassion, and that is admirable. But you only act morally when you act from duty, from recognition of the moral law itself. The good will, Kant famously argued, is the only thing good without qualification. Everything else, intelligence, courage, even happiness, can be misused or turned to evil ends. Only the will that acts from duty, regardless of inclination or consequence, is purely good. Two critiques published, two pillars of the system erected: theoretical reason and practical reason, knowledge and morality. But Kant sensed something missing, a gap between these two domains that needed bridging. The world of nature, as described by theoretical reason, operates according to mechanical laws, cause and effect, deterministic chains of physical necessity. The world of freedom, as required by practical reason, operates according to moral laws, duty and choice, the autonomous will acting from principle. How do these two worlds relate? How can we live in both simultaneously, experiencing ourselves as both natural beings subject to physical laws and free beings capable of moral choice? In 1790, at age 66, Kant published his third and final critique, the Critique of Judgment. It was in some ways his most subtle and complex work, dealing with experiences that seemed to bridge the gap between nature and freedom, aesthetic experience and our perception of purpose in nature. When we judge something beautiful, we are not simply reporting a fact about our feelings. Beauty is not purely subjective, a matter of personal taste about which there can be no dispute. Yet it is also not objective in the way that scientific facts are objective. When I say this flower is beautiful, I am making a claim that somehow demands agreement, that speaks as if the beauty were in the object itself. Yet I cannot prove this claim or force you to see what I see. Kant argued that judgments of beauty have a special character. They are universal without being based on concepts. When I experience something as beautiful, I experience a harmony between my imagination and understanding, a free play of mental faculties that produces pleasure. And because this harmony is based on the structure of human cognition, which is universal, I expect others to share my judgment. Beauty is not merely in the eye of the beholder, but neither is it a property of objects. It is a distinctive kind of experience, one that reveals something about how our minds work, about the relationship between our cognitive faculties. The second part of the critique dealt with teleology, with judgments of purpose in nature. When we look at a living organism, we cannot help but see it as organized toward ends, as if designed for survival and reproduction. The eye seems made for seeing, the heart for pumping blood, the wings of a bird for flight. Yet mechanistic science explains everything through efficient causes, through chains of physical necessity that know nothing of purposes or goals. How can we reconcile these two ways of experiencing nature? Kant's answer was that teleological judgments are not claims about how nature actually is, but necessary ways that we must think about certain phenomena, especially life. We cannot fully understand living things through mechanical explanation alone. We must also think of them as self-organizing wholes, as systems in which the parts exist for the sake of the whole, and the whole exists through the interaction of the parts. This is not knowledge in the strict sense, not something we can prove. It is a regulative principle, a way of thinking that guides our inquiry and allows us to make sense of phenomena that pure mechanism cannot fully explain. With the third critique, Kant's critical system was complete. He had examined the foundations of knowledge, the principles of morality, and the nature of aesthetic and teleological judgment. He had shown what reason can and cannot do, where its legitimate use ends, and where illusion begins. The three critiques together formed a comprehensive philosophy, an architecture of human reason that would influence philosophy, science, art, and theology for generations to come. Kant was now in his 60s, an old man by the standards of his time. His greatest works were published. His reputation was secure. But ahead lay trials of a different kind: political conflict, intellectual controversy, the slow decline of age, and the question of what legacy this small-town professor would leave to a world that was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The French Revolution had begun in 1789, just as Kant published the third critique. The old order was crumbling. New possibilities and new dangers were emerging. And Immanuel Kant, who had never left Königsberg, would have to navigate these turbulent times from the safety and limitation of his provincial study. In 1784, between the first and second critiques, Kant published a short essay that would become one of his most famous and widely read works. It was not a technical treatise on epistemology or ethics, not a dense argument requiring years of study to comprehend. It was a direct, passionate answer to a simple question posed by a Berlin journal: what is enlightenment? In just a few pages, Kant captured the spirit of an entire age and defined a movement that was reshaping European thought. His answer began with words that would echo through centuries. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. What did Kant mean by immaturity? Not the immaturity of children who lack the capacity for independent thought, but the immaturity of adults who possess reason but refuse to use it without guidance from others. It is the comfortable laziness of letting priests tell you what to believe, letting princes tell you what to think, letting books tell you what is true without examining the evidence yourself. It is easier, after all, to let others do your thinking for you. It requires no courage, no effort, no risk. But it is also to live as less than fully human, to surrender the very faculty that makes us rational beings. Kant's motto for enlightenment became famous: sapere aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding. This was not merely intellectual advice, but a moral challenge, even a political one. To think for yourself is to reject the authority of those who claim the right to think for you. It is to question tradition, to examine dogma, to subject all claims to the tribunal of reason. It is, inevitably, to challenge existing powers, whether religious or political, that depend on the obedience of those who do not think too carefully. Yet Kant was no revolutionary in the political sense, no advocate of violent overthrow or sudden transformation. He distinguished carefully between the public use of reason, which must be free, and the private use of reason which might require obedience. A soldier must obey orders. That is the private use of reason in his role as soldier. But the same soldier, as a scholar or citizen, must be free to publish his thoughts on military policy, to criticize what he believes is wrong. A clergyman must preach the doctrines of his church. That is his contracted duty. But as a scholar, he must be free to examine those doctrines, to propose reforms, to follow his conscience and reason wherever they lead. This distinction allowed Kant to support enlightenment while maintaining loyalty to the Prussian state. He could argue for freedom of thought and speech in the public sphere, while accepting that in one's official capacity, obedience to law and authority might be required. It was a careful balance, perhaps too careful for those who wanted more radical change. But Kant genuinely believed that gradual enlightenment through education and free inquiry was the path to progress. That violent revolution was more likely to replace one tyranny with another than to establish genuine freedom. The essay made Kant famous beyond academic circles. Here was philosophy that spoke to the concerns of ordinary educated people, that connected abstract principles to concrete questions about how to live in society. But it also marked Kant as a potentially dangerous thinker in the eyes of conservative authorities. As the 1780s progressed, and especially after the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the Prussian government grew increasingly nervous about revolutionary ideas, and Kant, whatever his personal caution, had articulated principles that could easily be turned toward radical ends. Freedom of thought, autonomy of reason, the right to question authority, these were not abstract philosophical concepts. They were the intellectual foundations of the revolutionary age. Kant had lit a fire in an essay about enlightenment. Soon he would discover that fires, once lit, are not easily controlled. As Kant entered his late 60s, having completed his critical system, he turned his attention to a topic he had deliberately avoided in his major works: religion. It was dangerous territory. Prussia was officially a Christian state, and while it had a reputation for tolerance compared to some European nations, there were clear limits to what could be publicly discussed regarding religious matters. The king, Friedrich Wilhelm II, who had ascended to the throne in 1787, was far more religiously orthodox than his predecessor, and his minister, Johann Christoph Wöllner, had instituted strict censorship of writings that might undermine Christian faith or public morals. In 1792 and 93, Kant published a series of essays that would be collected as Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason. The title itself was provocative. Religion within the bounds of reason, not revelation, not scripture, not church authority, but reason alone. Kant's project was to show what remains of Christianity when you strip away everything that depends on historical revelation, everything that requires blind faith, everything that cannot be justified by reason. What remains, he argued, is a moral religion, a faith centered entirely on ethical duty and the moral improvement of humanity. Kant reinterpreted Christian doctrines in purely moral terms. Original sin became the universal human tendency toward evil, the propensity to prioritize self-interest over moral duty. Redemption became the moral transformation of character, the victory of the goodwill over selfish inclination. The Church became an ethical community, united not by shared rituals or beliefs about miracles, but by common commitment to moral principles. Grace was the mysterious fact that moral transformation is possible, that we can become better than we are. Everything supernatural, everything miraculous, everything historical and particular about Christianity was translated into universal, rational, moral terms. For Kant, this was not an attack on Christianity, but its purification, its rescue from superstition and priestcraft. True religion, he argued, is moral religion, and Christianity at its best is precisely such a religion. Jesus was important not because he was God incarnate or because he performed miracles, but because he exemplified the perfect moral will, the ideal of humanity living in full accordance with the moral law. Prayer is valuable not because God will intervene to grant our wishes, but because it strengthens our moral resolve. Church attendance matters not because of any magical efficacy of sacraments, but because ethical community supports moral development. The authorities were not pleased. The book clearly challenged orthodox belief, reducing revealed religion to mere morality, treating miracles as myths, emptying traditional doctrines of their supernatural content. In October 1794, Kant received a letter that would change the last decade of his life. It came from the king himself, or rather from Völner writing in the king's name, and it was a severe rebuke. The letter accused Kant of misusing his philosophy to undermine and debase fundamental doctrines of Christianity, of showing ingratitude toward his sovereign who had supported him, and of betraying the duty of a teacher to youth. It concluded with an ominous warning. If Kant continued to offend in this manner, he could expect unpleasant measures. The threat was clear. Kant could lose his position, his pension, perhaps even his freedom. He was 70 years old, too old to start over, too established to simply disappear into obscurity. After careful consideration, Kant wrote a response that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He promised, as His Majesty's most loyal subject, to abstain entirely from all public lectures and writings concerning religion, whether natural or revealed. It was submission, and Kant knew it. He had advocated for freedom of thought, had written Dare to Know, had championed enlightenment and autonomy, and when tested, he had submitted to censorship rather than face the consequences of his principles. Yet Kant found a way to live with this submission. He had promised to abstain as the king's subject, and he interpreted this to mean only during the lifetime of Friedrich Wilhelm II. When the king died in 1797, Kant considered himself released from his promise. But the damage had been done, not to his work, but to his conscience. The man who had written that we must treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means had allowed himself to be silenced, had treated his own rational autonomy as negotiable. It was a small tragedy in a life otherwise marked by remarkable integrity. Even philosophers, it seemed, are human, subject to fear, capable of compromise. The ideal of enlightenment was clearer than the path of living it. As Kant entered his 70s, something remarkable happened. He became, in his own lifetime, a historical figure, the founder of a school, the beginning of a tradition. Young philosophers across Germany studied his works, wrote commentaries, traveled to Königsberg to attend his lectures, or simply to meet the great man. Some came to praise, others to criticize, but all recognized that Kant had changed the landscape of philosophy so thoroughly that no serious thinker could ignore him. To do philosophy now meant to position oneself in relation to Kant, to accept his framework or to reject it, but always to reckon with it. The first generation of Kant's followers attempted to be faithful disciples, to clarify his system, to defend it against misunderstanding, to apply his principles to new domains. Karl Leonhard Reinhold, who had been instrumental in making Kant's philosophy known beyond academic circles, worked to systematize the critical philosophy, to make it more accessible, to derive all of Kant's conclusions from a single foundational principle. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, initially an enthusiastic Kantian, developed what he called the Wissenschaftslehre, the science of knowledge, which attempted to ground all philosophy in the pure activity of the self. But something strange happened as these younger philosophers worked with Kant's ideas. The system began to shift under their hands, to transform into something Kant himself did not quite recognize. Fichte radicalized Kant's emphasis on the activity of the mind, arguing that the self posits not just the form of experience, but its very content, that the external world is ultimately a product of consciousness rather than something independent that consciousness structures. This was not Kant's position. Kant had always maintained that while we cannot know things in themselves, they nonetheless exist independently of our minds, providing the raw material that our cognitive faculties then organize into experience. Kant watched these developments with mixed feelings. He was proud that his work had inspired such brilliant young minds, grateful that philosophy in Germany was undergoing a renaissance. But he was also disturbed by what he saw as misinterpretations and distortions of his carefully constructed system. When Fichte sent him his works, expecting approval from the master, Kant's response was polite but cool. He did not recognize his own philosophy in Fichte's transformation of it. The emphasis on the absolute self, the reduction of the external world to a mere projection of consciousness. This struck Kant as precisely the kind of speculative excess that his critical philosophy was meant to eliminate. After Fichte came Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who pushed even further into speculative territory, developing a philosophy of nature and absolute idealism that transformed Kant's careful distinctions into a grand metaphysical system. And then came Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who would become the most influential German philosopher of the 19th century, who took Kant's critical philosophy as a starting point, but then argued that all of Kant's limits could be overcome. That absolute knowledge was possible after all, that the contradictions Kant had identified in pure reason were not dead ends but dialectical, moments in reason's progress toward complete self-understanding. Kant lived long enough to see the beginning of this movement, this transformation of his critical philosophy into German idealism. He did not fully understand where it was going, could not have imagined that Hegel would eventually construct a system that claimed to accomplish precisely what Kant had declared impossible. But he recognized that something fundamental had shifted, that his students had become something more and less than disciples. They had become independent thinkers, using his work as a springboard to projects he would not have endorsed. There is something both satisfying and melancholy about this situation. Kant had spent his life arguing for intellectual autonomy, for the courage to think for yourself, for enlightenment understood as emergence from tutelage. Now his own students were exercising precisely this autonomy, thinking for themselves, refusing to be bound by the master's conclusions. They were following his method of never accepting authority without examination. Even when that authority was Kant himself, he should have been pleased. And perhaps, in his more philosophical moments, he was. But he was also human, and it is hard for any thinker to watch their carefully constructed system be dismantled and rebuilt by those who claim to be honoring it. The revolution Kant had started was moving beyond his control, taking directions he had not anticipated, producing consequences he could not have foreseen. Such is the fate of all revolutionary thinkers. They light the fire, but they cannot control where it spreads. Time, which Kant had argued was merely a form of human intuition rather than a feature of things in themselves, proved relentless in its effects on the philosopher's own body and mind. As the new century approached, those who had known Kant for decades began to notice changes. The famous punctuality wavered. The daily walk, that clockwork routine by which citizens had set their timepieces, became irregular, then ceased altogether. The brilliant conversationalist who had once held dinner tables, spellbound with witty observations on politics, science and art, now sometimes lost the thread of discussion, repeating himself, forgetting what had been said moments before. By 1800, when Kant was 76, the decline was unmistakable. He continued to lecture at the university, driven by a sense of duty and perhaps by the routine that had structured his entire adult life. But students who came expecting the legendary professor found instead an old man struggling with material he had once commanded effortlessly. He would lose his place in lectures, confuse concepts, trail off mid-sentence. Sometimes he would begin a thought and simply stop, staring at his notes as if they were written in a language he no longer understood. It was painful to witness this brilliant mind slowly dimming like a lamp running out of oil. his colleagues and friends faced a terrible dilemma. Kant clearly could no longer fulfill his duties, yet how does one tell a man of such stature, such dignity, that he must stop? Who has the authority to inform the greatest philosopher of the age that his time has passed? They approached the subject delicately, suggesting perhaps a rest, a temporary leave, a reduction in responsibilities. Kant resisted at first, clinging to the routine that had defined him, unwilling or unable to acknowledge the extent of his decline. But eventually, in 1801, he gave his final lecture. He was 77 years old, and the career that had spanned more than 4 decades was over. Retirement brought no relief, only a different kind of suffering. Kant's world contracted to his house, his study, his daily routines now managed by servants who watched him with concern and pity. His memory, that faculty he had analyzed so carefully in his philosophical work, betrayed him with increasing frequency. He would forget names of old friends, lose track of what day it was, ask the same questions repeatedly. Sometimes he would become agitated, frustrated by his inability to recall things that had once been immediately accessible. Other times he seemed distant, lost in some internal world that others could not reach. Yet even in decline, moments of the old Kant would emerge. A visitor might mention a philosophical problem, and suddenly the fog would lift, the old precision would return, and for a few minutes the great mind would be present again, analyzing, arguing, clarifying. These moments became rarer as time passed, brief flashes of light in gathering darkness. His friends treasured them, these glimpses of the man they had known, even as they mourned what was being lost. The physical decline accompanied the mental deterioration. Kant had never been robust, always slight of build, narrow-chested, prone to digestive troubles. Now his body weakened further. He moved slowly, shuffled rather than walked, needed assistance with basic tasks. The man who had once been meticulous about his appearance, who had dressed carefully for his daily walk, now sometimes appeared disheveled, confused about which clothes to wear. His servant Lampe, who had been with him for decades, managed the household and protected Kant's dignity as much as possible, shielding him from visitors who might have been shocked by how far the great philosopher had fallen. There is something deeply human and deeply tragic about these final years. Kant had spent his life examining the powers and limits of reason, had argued that rational autonomy was the essence of human dignity, had insisted that we must always treat humanity as an end in itself. Now that very autonomy was slipping away, that rational capacity fading, and there was nothing philosophy could do to prevent it. The mind that had critiqued pure reason could not critique its own dissolution. The will that had defined moral autonomy could no longer fully govern itself. Kant, who had mapped the boundaries of human knowledge, now experienced the boundary where knowledge itself dissolves into confusion and forgetting. It was a final, cruel lesson in the limits of human existence, one that no amount of philosophical insight could prevent or explain away. The winter of 1803 was harsh in Königsberg, and Kant, now 79, was fading visibly. He spent most of his time in bed, barely eating, drifting in and out of consciousness. His physician, a man who had cared for him for years, knew the end was near. Word spread through the city and beyond that the great philosopher was dying. Former students, colleagues, friends came to pay their respects, though Kant was often too weak or too confused to recognize them. They would sit by his bedside, holding the hand of a man who had reshaped how humanity thinks about itself, watching him slip away. In early February 1804, Kant's condition deteriorated rapidly. He could no longer speak clearly, could barely swallow. His breathing became labored, each breath a struggle. Yet those who attended him in those final days reported something remarkable. Even in his weakness, even in his confusion, Kant seemed to retain some core of dignity, some essential self that remained intact. When his doctor visited, Kant would attempt to rise to show the respect that courtesy demanded, though he lacked the strength. The habits of a lifetime, the discipline of decades, persisted even as consciousness faded. On February 12, 1804, as morning light filtered through the windows of his modest house on Prinzessinstrasse, Immanuel Kant drew his last breath. He was 79 years old. According to those present, his final words were, "Es ist gut," it is good. Whether he meant that death was good, or that his life had been good, or simply that the struggle was over, we cannot know. Perhaps all three meanings were present in those simple words. The man who had spent his life analyzing the structure of thought, who had argued that we can never know things in themselves but only as they appear to us, had reached the final appearance, the last phenomenon. What lay beyond, if anything, was a question his philosophy had declared unanswerable. News of Kant's death spread quickly through Königsberg and then throughout the German-speaking world and beyond. The response was extraordinary for someone who had lived such a quiet, unremarkable life in external terms. Kant had never held political office, never traveled beyond his provincial region, never commanded armies or accumulated wealth or involved himself in the dramatic events of his age. He had simply taught, written, walked, dined with friends and thought. Yet his death was mourned as the passing of a giant, someone whose influence transcended the boundaries of philosophy and touched the very foundations of modern thought. The funeral, held on February 28th, was a major event in Königsberg. Thousands attended, far more than could fit in the church. Professors, students, city officials, merchants, ordinary citizens who had never read a word of Kant's dense prose, but who knew that someone important had lived among them. The procession wound through the streets that Kant had walked daily for decades, past the university where he had taught for nearly 50 years, past the houses of friends who had shared countless dinners and conversations with him. He was buried in the cathedral, in the professor's vault, a place of honor for someone who had brought such distinction to the city. In death, Kant returned fully to Königsberg, the city he had never really left. His body rested in Prussian soil, in the provincial city at the edge of the Baltic that had been his entire world. He had never seen Paris or London, never witnessed the Mediterranean or the Alps, never traveled to the great capitals and cultural centers of Europe. His longest journey had been about 40 miles, a distance most people of his time would cover without thinking. Yet his mind had traveled further than any explorer's ship, had charted territories no map could show, had discovered continents of thought that no physical voyage could reach. The man who never left home had, in the most important sense, gone everywhere. And now, after 79 years in this particular form of intuition called life, Immanuel Kant had reached the limit of possible experience, the boundary where all philosophy ends and silence begins. In the 2 centuries since Kant's death, something remarkable has happened. No major philosopher has been able to simply ignore him. You can reject Kant, you can criticize him, you can attempt to refute him or move beyond him, but you cannot pretend he never existed. He stands at the center of modern philosophy like a mountain that every subsequent thinker must either climb or navigate around. The question is no longer whether Kant was right about everything. Clearly he was not. The question is how to deal with the fundamental problems he identified, the revolutionary perspective he introduced, the boundaries he mapped between what we can and cannot know. Kant's most immediate impact was on epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Before Kant, philosophers generally assumed that knowledge meant the mind somehow mirroring or corresponding to an independent reality. After Kant, this naive realism became impossible to maintain. We cannot compare our knowledge to reality as it is in itself, because we have no access to reality except through the structures our minds impose on experience. This does not mean Kant endorsed idealism in the sense of denying external reality, but it does mean that all our knowledge is unavoidably shaped by human cognitive faculties, that we are, in a sense, trapped inside our own minds, experiencing not the world as it is, but the world as it appears to beings, with our particular way of processing information. This insight reverberated through every subsequent philosophical movement. The German idealists Fichte, Schelling, Hegel took Kant's emphasis on the mind's activity and pushed it further, arguing that consciousness is more fundamental than matter, that reality itself is somehow mind-dependent or even mind-created. The phenomenologists Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty returned to Kant's insight that we must study the structures of experience itself, the way things appear to consciousness, before we can make claims about what exists independently. Even the analytic philosophers of the 20th century, who often define themselves in opposition to German idealism, found themselves constantly returning to Kantian themes, the role of conceptual schemes in organizing experience, the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, the limits of what can be said meaningfully. Kant's ethical philosophy proved equally influential, though in more contested ways. The categorical imperative, the demand to universalize one's maxims and to treat people as ends rather than means, became foundational for modern moral philosophy. It influenced utilitarians who disagreed with it, virtue ethicists who rejected its emphasis on duty over character, and deontologists who embraced it. More broadly, Kant's insistence that morality must be grounded in reason rather than religion, emotion or tradition helped secularize ethics, making it possible to discuss right and wrong without reference to divine commands or religious authority. In political philosophy, Kant's influence is equally profound, though sometimes less recognized. His essays on perpetual peace, on the right to revolution, on cosmopolitan citizenship and international law anticipated many central concerns of modern political theory. His argument that people should be treated as ends in themselves became foundational for human rights discourse. His vision of a federation of free states, each respecting individual liberty while cooperating on common concerns, influenced the development of international organizations and the very concept of universal human rights. Beyond philosophy proper, Kant's influence extended into psychology, cognitive science, and even physics. His argument that space and time are forms of human intuition rather than features of reality itself anticipated aspects of Einstein's relativity. His analysis of how the mind synthesizes experience influenced the development of cognitive psychology. His work on aesthetics shaped art theory and criticism. His writings on religion influenced theology. Both liberal Protestantism, which embraced his moral interpretation of Christianity, and orthodox reaction against it. Yet perhaps, Kant's deepest legacy is not any particular doctrine, but a way of doing philosophy, a style of thinking that became paradigmatic for the modern era. Kant taught philosophers to examine their own assumptions, to question the very possibility of their inquiries, to ask not just, "What can I know?" but "How is knowledge possible?" He made self-criticism, critique in the technical sense of examining the conditions and limits of reason itself, central to philosophical method. Every subsequent philosopher learned from Kant that you cannot simply assert conclusions. You must examine the frameworks within which those conclusions make sense. As the 21st century progresses, Kant remains inescapable. New technologies raise questions about artificial intelligence and consciousness that return us to Kantian questions about the nature of mind and experience. Globalization raises questions about cosmopolitan ethics and international justice that Kant addressed. Debates about moral relativism and universal values echo the tension between Kant's insistence on universal moral law and the recognition that actual moral codes vary across cultures and history. The little professor from Königsberg who never traveled and who spent his life in obscurity by any ordinary measure of fame or influence, who simply taught and wrote and thought, continues to shape how we think about ourselves and our world. His body rests in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, the city that was his entire geographical world. But his mind, his ideas, his revolutionary way of thinking about thinking itself, these have traveled to every corner of the intellectual world, and they show no sign of fading. In the end, perhaps Kant discovered the deepest truth, that the mind does not need to travel physically to reach everywhere. That thought knows no borders, that ideas once released into the world can never be contained or controlled. He never left his city, but his city, in the ways that matter most, became the entire world.